All right. So what we were looking at before was these three portfolios. Okay. And in these three portfolios, we could look at the expected return and standard deviation of each one. Okay. And we noticed that the portfolio that contained more stocks and fewer bonds had a higher expected return, but it also had a larger standard deviation. And then as we moved into a second position, this was a 80-20 mix. As soon as we moved to a 60-40 mix, we noticed that we lost a little bit in terms of a return, but we reduced the volatility significantly. Okay. And the volatility went down to 12%. And then if we wanted to go further, it required us to reallocate. And this was a 40-60 position. Okay. But it reduced the volatility down to 8%. Okay. And it also was accompanied by a drop in the expected return. Okay. So that's kind of what we looked at. And then finally we said, hey, if you want to go all the way and cover the whole risk spectrum from no risk, which is all your money is in treasury bills, okay, to some of your money in treasury bills and some of your money into some portfolio, okay, this 40-60 portfolio, okay, you could get risk anywhere on this spectrum. Yeah. But if you want a higher return, at some point in time, you're going to have to take on riskier securities and be accompanied by higher volatility. Okay. So this is the general rule in terms of a glide path for traditional asset allocation. Okay. And what we'll notice, and I'll show you in just a second, is that we don't want to go to all bonds. Okay. Because all bonds loses some of the diversification benefit of stocks. Okay. So instead, we kind of keep some exposure to stocks, but holds money in cash. And the more you hold in cash, the lower your volatility. Okay. But some of your money still gets a chance, okay, to earn the higher returns associated with stock. All right. So let me deviate for just a second. And I'm going to go ahead and look at one of the Excel files. And this is called a 2-asset frontier. I'll show you how the frontier is developed. This is the Excel sheet 2-asset frontier. All right. And here I've kind of given different states of the economy. Oops. Hold on. There we go. Okay. So I've given different states of the economy. And basically, I'm kind of showing you, hey, there's a 20% chance of an expansion, which if we broke this down on a 10-year cycle, okay, 2 years we'd have an expansion. There's a 50% probability of normal growth. So 5 out of 10 years would be normal growth. and a 30% chance for a recession, which means 3 out of the 10 years we would be in a recession. Yeah. So what this is looking at what happens to the return of different securities. This could be a stock fund and a bond fund. Okay. We look at these two securities, and during an expansion, okay, A will earn 25% during those large expansionary periods, which is only 2 out of 10 years. Okay. So it'll earn 25%, and bonds will earn about 5. During normal times, we have stocks earning 10 and maybe bonds earning 8. During a recession, maybe stocks earn 5 and bonds earn 14. Okay, this is just a hypothetical example, obviously. Yeah, but that's how you can kind of view it. Okay. Now, if we look at this, what we can see is if we have a portfolio that's made up of half stock and half bonds, okay, then you can see that our portfolio on average would earn 15% during an expansion, 9% during normal times, and 9.5% during a recession. Okay. So this is the 50-50 portfolio. You can see what the expected return of the stock is and the expected return of the bond. We could calculate the standard deviation of each of these. Okay. And we can calculate the correlation. Now notice in my example, I have a large negative correlation. This is not realistic. Most of the time you can get somewhere between -0.2 to -0.35 is about sort of the best you can hope for. Okay, but this exaggerates the point. Okay, so if we look at the correlation between these two, you can see that they're negatively correlated. One goes up when the other is going down. Okay. But as a hypothetical example, it shows you that half your money in A and half your money in B. Okay. Notice what happens in terms of the portfolio. The average risk of the portfolio is rather small, even though the individual stocks that make up that portfolio are rather large. Okay. So by having a 50-50 portfolio during good times, okay, your average is around 15. During poor times, the average is around 9.5. Okay. So the expected return on this portfolio is like 10.35%. But look at the standard deviation. It's very small because no matter what happens, one of them is going to be doing better than the other. And that's the whole idea of the diversification. You can actually calculate something called a minimum variance portfolio, and you can find where the standard deviation is minimized. It's just a linear programming problem. And you may have learned about linear programming in another class. Okay. So we have a linear programming problem that says, hey, try to find the minimum variance by changing these values. Okay. And you know a couple things. The weight of A plus the weight of B has to be equal to 100%. Okay. And then you're minimizing the standard deviation by changing these weights subject to a constraint. Okay. So it's one of those old-fashioned linear programming problems. Okay. So basically 30% A, 70% B is a minimum variance point. Okay. Now, if we look ahead to the second sheet, okay, the second sheet will demonstrate the curvature that we get. And the curvature that we get is due to the negative correlation. Okay. And you can kind of see what I mean here. If we start out with 90% stocks, and 10% bonds, we're out here where the expected return is the highest, but also the standard deviation is the highest. Okay. As we decrease our A position and increase our B position, okay, we end up with less risk, but also lower returns. Okay. At some point in time, we hit a point. That's our minimum variance point. Okay. Our minimum variance point, remember, was 30% stocks and 70% bonds, roughly. This is our minimum variance point. Okay. So what that tells me is the upper half of this curve is the efficient frontier. So it basically says you wouldn't want to hold anything less than 70% of your money in bonds. This part right here is inefficient. So how do we reduce risk if we wanted even less risk? Okay, we use cash. Okay. So we reach a point, if we were going to blow this up, and this was real, it's not, it's a canned example. But if this was real and we could achieve this somehow, which would be awesome, but we can't, yeah, then this is where you would put someone in their 20s and 30s. As they move to 30 to 40, 40 to 50, maybe 55, 60, and finally 65. Okay. As people get older and can afford less risk, we adjust their allocation. Okay. So the young people should be holding more stocks than bonds, and older people should be holding more bonds than stocks, for some appropriate combination of stocks and bonds. Okay. Then if they wanted to, okay, we could move down the spectrum by putting some money in cash. And you can see you can do it with any point in time, yeah, but usually we pick the allocation that has the most bonds to start our line. And theoretically, you would start it at this minimum variance point, but rarely do people do that. Okay. So you're not losing a lot if you use one of these 3 points on the lower end of the frontier. But theoretically, you could reduce risk by adding cash to any point on the frontier. Yeah. So what you can kind of see from a theoretical standpoint, is that if you had a portfolio that was half stock and half bonds, and you added a risk-free rate to it, okay, then you could find any point between this 50-50 portfolio, which was just one of the points on the frontier. Okay. And if you want to reduce risk, you combine it with the risk-free rate. Half cash, half stocks and bonds, of which half your money is half stocks and half bonds, so half of half, okay, would put you right in the middle of these 2 points. This is a linear relationship. Okay? This would be about 80-20. This would be 70-30 the other way. Okay. All right. So that kind of gives us a little bit of background. You can look back at this and see. But before I go any further, let me check my, no, not ready yet. All right. So let's go back and see how this applies. So we already saw our 3 allocations. That's what we did last time. We looked at our 3 allocations. And if we wanted to drop down below RA3, we used RA3 in cash. Okay. So RA3 in cash could get us below the standard deviation of RA3. So if this was RA3 in a plot format and you wanted to reduce the risk even further, you could combine it with risk-free securities. Okay. And then depending on your allocation, you could get the risk all the way down to 0, which would be 100% in money market securities, or you could put half in money market securities and half in RA3, and you'd be halfway between 0 and 8%. Yeah. And 80% RA3, 20% money market would be up here. That's what we were solving for. And that reduces the risk down to 6.4%. All right. Now, if we look on the second page, that's kind of where we left off last time with a little bit of extra thrown in. The big thing that we want to figure out now is how do we find the expected return of each of these portfolios? Okay. So we found the expected return of RA1 as the weighted average of stocks So it was large cap stocks, small cap stocks, international, plus the weight we had in bonds. And I think we were using corporate bonds. Okay. But now the question is, this was all given. Okay. The expected return for stocks was given. How do we find, for instance, the expected return of the large cap stock portfolio? Okay. Well, the large cap stock portfolio is just made up of a bunch of different large cap stocks, okay, with different amounts of money in it. Okay. So what we do know, since each portfolio of large cap stocks maybe contains 30 to 40 actively managed or some indexed portfolio, okay, then what we have to do is figure out what's the expected return of the large cap stock portfolio or international or small cap. Okay, is that we need to know the beta coefficient for each stock inside that portfolio. Okay. So if large cap stock portfolio A, okay, was made up of IBM, Walmart, okay, Starbucks, and eBay, and Harley Davidson, okay, then we need to figure out what's the beta of the large cap stock portfolio. Okay. So again, everything's just a weighted average of a weighted average of a weighted average. Okay. So if we go in here and look at A, notice this portfolio has 20, that's 50, it's $100,000. But it holds 10% in IBM, 10% in Walmart, 30% in Harley Davidson, 30% in Starbucks, and 20% in eBay. So if we look at this, we can figure out the beta as a weighted average of the stocks that make up that portfolio. So the beta for large stack portfolio A would be 1.3. Now you can see here, okay, this mutual fund manager is holding more money in higher risk stocks. So his expected return is going to be higher, okay, or required return. If you look at portfolio B, which contains the same securities, but's managed by someone different, there's more money in IBM, more money in Walmart, less money in Harley Davidson, less money in Starbucks, and less money in eBay. Okay. So if we look at that, and you can see depending on your allocation of each individual stock, the betas are going to be different. Okay. So you can have large cap stock portfolios that are high risk, or you could have large stock portfolios that are lower risk, or most likely something in between. Okay. So if you were to do C, you get something like 0.76. Okay. Oops, I made a mistake here. Let me recalculate this. .96. Okay. So you could end up with a portfolio. Yeah. Same securities, but depending on the weights, will have a different beta. Okay. Or you could have a large stock portfolio that contains less risky stocks, and it can have a lower beta. Now, once you look at the beta, you go back to your old friend, the capital asset pricing model, and to find the expected return of the large cap portfolio, it's going to be a function of the risk-free rate, beta, and the market risk premium. So what we can see, if the risk-free rate is 1% and the market risk premium is 7%, then large cap stock portfolio A would have an expected return of 10.1%. But large cap stock portfolio B would have a return of 7.72%. Is that right? Yep. Okay. And C would have a required return of 6.32%. Okay. So again, everything's going to be a function. What your asset allocation suggests, is even though we're suggesting some allocation, the large cap stock with an expected return of 10 and a standard deviation of 22 really depends on which large cap stock mutual fund you pick. Are you going to pick one that's high beta or low beta? That's going to affect your expected returns, which is why these rule of thumbs are kind of ambiguous, because it doesn't say. If we look back at Fidelity or we look back at Charles Schwab, and people are recommending a 70-30 or 60-40 split, it's not telling you what types of stocks they're investing in or what types of bonds they're investing in. So it's going to depend upon what they're using as their large cap mutual fund. Are they using an index fund, or are they using some actively managed fund? Are they using one that's a higher beta or lower beta? What stocks are inside it? So that's why all that information that we can gather is so important, because it lets us figure out how much risk is inside each portfolio that we're using for our allocation. All right, any questions on finding the beta of a portfolio, finding the expected return of a portfolio, or putting portfolios together to create an asset allocation? I don't expect you to be able to find the standard deviation of a particular asset allocation, but I would expect you to be able to figure out the expected return. So it's kind of a lot of information. It kind of comes full circle. But you can see with 10,000 mutual funds, to pick from, it's kind of important. And that's how each fund manager or investment manager does things a little bit differently. So someone asks, is higher beta considered as higher risk? Yes, okay. So beta is measuring the risk that's non-diversifiable. So it kind of makes sense if you look at it, it's really exposure to economic risk, okay? The reason a company like Walmart has a beta of 0.6, part of it depends on the type of goods they sell. So since they sell sort of necessity items and they're a retailer, then even during economic recessions, people still go to Walmart. Even during a crisis like this, Walmart's holding up pretty well. In other words, people are still shopping there. Harley Davidson is a high beta stock because it's very sensitive to economic conditions. When unemployment is high, people are not buying as many motorcycles because it's not really considered a necessity good. It's kind of more of a luxury. And for most people, it's not their only form of transportation. So someone like Harley Davidson is a high beta, which means it's going to do really well during a boom time and not so well during a recession. And they probably sell those on a lot higher margin than someone like Walmart does. All right. Any other questions before we go back and look at some of the homework problems? I do want to show you one more thing, though, now that we've kind of seen that. It's kind of a repeat. It's the file it's a Word file, and it's something like asset, I think it's asset allocation over time is what it's called. I'll show you a picture of it. It's asset allocation application over time if you're looking for it. And it looks something like this. All right, I'll give you a second to find it. All right. So if you look at, it says assume the following information. Okay. So suppose we pick some large cap mutual fund. We found the beta of the mutual fund, which the beta of the mutual fund is usually given. You don't really have to calculate it. Okay. We found the beta of this mutual fund. We can figure out the expected return going forward by looking at the risk-free rate plus beta times the market risk premium. And suppose we calculate that as 10%. So it kind of depends on the large cap stock portfolio mutual fund you pick, but suppose it has an expected return of 10%. The standard deviation will also be given. So if you went and looked, and we could look, but if you looked at, you probably go to Morningstar, library.morningstar.com, pull up a mutual fund, look around, you'll be able to find the return, not the return, but you'll be able to find the beta will be given. And so will the standard deviation. Yeah. And if we have a second, I may look for that. Okay. But all this information can be found, not the expected returns. No one will give you an expected return, but they will give you the beta, which you can use to calculate it. And they'll also give you the standard deviation, probably over a 3-year or 5-year average. A lot of people use 5-year. Okay. Then we can look at mid-cap stocks. Mid-cap stocks, depending on which companies you own, okay, will have a different beta. They may have a different return and risk profile. Okay. You can do the same thing with small cap stocks. Do the same thing with international stocks. Okay. And again, we just search for some kind of mutual fund and pick out which fund we would like to include. And depending on which mutual funds you include will determine your recommendation. Okay. Which is why everyone's recommendations is a little bit different. But if you analyzed it closely, it probably all follows the same path in terms of a risk return profile. Because we sort of assume in an efficient market that these hold. Okay. We can look at corporate bonds and government bonds. Most of the time, to find the expected return on a corporate bond, we look at their average credit rating. Okay. Then we can go in and compare it to what the current yield to maturity on that credit rating is. Okay. And do the same thing for government bonds. Okay. Government bonds, though, are usually risk-free, sort of, but they will still have some amount of risk depending on the duration and coupon payments. Okay. So we found 6 mutual funds that we're going to use. And it doesn't matter who comes in, remember. We can use these same 6 mutual funds over and over again. Someone comes in their 30s, or in their 50s, or in their 60s. We'll still use these same 6 mutual funds. We'll just put each client in as a different percentage of their money. Okay. So we're creating these frontiers. We know down here is inefficient. Okay. So suppose you create risky asset portfolio 1. It's made up of 80% stocks and 20% bonds. Okay. And notice we don't have any government bonds. We don't have any mid-cap stocks. We're just using large, small, international, and corporate. Okay. The expected return should be easy to calculate. The standard deviation is hard to calculate. Okay. You have to go in and use historical data, run an Excel spreadsheet, okay, figure out the portfolio, and then calculate the standard deviation. But I mean hard, after you've done it a couple times, it may take 10 minutes. Okay. So it's not extremely difficult. Okay. So to find the portfolio's expected returns, pretty easy. Okay. We have 50% of our money that's expected to earn 10%. We have 15% of our money that's expected to earn 13%. Okay. We have 15% of our money that's expected to earn 12%. And we have 20% of our money that's expected to earn 7%. And so what happens to find the expected return of the portfolio? Which is made up of a bunch of different mutual funds held in different allocation percentages. Okay. All right, so you should be able to get 10.15%. And then this I calculated for you. Okay. All right, let me see if there's any questions. All right, if there's not any questions, we'll keep going. So if you kind of look down, suppose you have some young person comes in with $100,000. They're willing to accept a fairly high amount of risk. So you would take the 100,000 and put them in an 80-20 mix. I.e., you'd put 50,000 in large cap stocks, 15 in small, 15 in international, and 20,000 in bonds. All right. And this would be kind of the expected return and standard deviation that they would expect. All right, suppose after 5 years, their portfolio has grown to 200,000 because they continually added money to it, and maybe the portfolio earned some money. Okay. Every year, though, we would reallocate so that we're kind of within that same 50, 15, 15, 20 mark. Okay. So if one tended to do really well, we'd sell some of it and put it into something else that didn't do as well as we expected. And that's what's called rebalancing. Okay. So suppose stocks did great and large cap stocks, for instance, went up a lot more than we thought, and the bonds didn't go up as much as we thought, maybe even they went down. Yeah. Then we'd sell some of the stocks and buy more bonds until we had 20% in bonds. Okay. So every day, you don't rebalance every day, but most people rebalance about once a year. Okay. Some people rebalance every 6 months. Okay. Most people, though, rebalance about once a year. Okay. All right. Now, after 5 years, they're worried about having too much risk and they want to reduce the volatility. Okay. And they decided they wanted to move from 17% down to 12%. Okay. So there's two potential choices that they can do. Okay. You can leave them in what I call risky allocation 1. So you could leave them in risky allocation 1. Let me, losing internet-ish stuff here. All right, so I've lost my internet on the other side, but I haven't lost you here. Maybe it will return in a minute. Maybe it won't. What to do? I don't want to close everything out, but I may have to. Oh, I don't want to do that. Let me just walk you through it. Although I don't have a copy in front of me. Let me see if I can open up another copy. No. All right. I don't know what to do. I'm afraid if I get off here, I won't be able to get back on and record again. But let me go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and get off here, and I'll come right back on in a few minutes. Let me see if I can open something else up instead. Actually, I'm not going to get off. I'm going to do this. We'll come back to that. You can read through that and see. Basically, what happens is you can either move from RA1 down to RA2, down to RA3 over time, or you can choose between RA1 and a money market security. And what it's showing you, I'll just explain it. What it's showing you is that RA1 in a money market is not as efficient as readjusting the allocations and creating a new RA2 out of those same mutual funds, just a different weight. Okay? And then if you want to reduce risk even further, it's actually more appropriate to go down to a reallocation than it is to use cash. And so the idea is that most people will follow the line until they reach some point on that frontier where holding cash versus reallocating is sort of a minimal difference. All right, let me see if I can. Oops. Not that. I'm so worried about losing connection because then I'll lose the recording. All right, give me just a second. Let's see. Oh, it's slow. So I think the internet's just slow. All right. I think I got something for you. All right. So I'm probably not going to write on this. Just going to walk it through. It's going to be hard for me. All right. So what I'm shifting to just in the last 15 or 20 minutes is looking at the homework problems. Because remember, we're going to have a quiz that opens up at 3:15. So I want to show you kind of the things we're looking at. So if you look at the questions from chapter 11, I'm going to go ahead and try to save some bandwidth. All right, so if you look at chapter 11 questions, we're looking at page 395 and 396. So if you open it up, 395, you start with problems 1 and 2. You can kind of see that they're asking for the expected return and the standard deviation. Okay. So to find the expected return, we've got a stock that has a 25% probability of a recession, 50% normal times, 25% boom times. Find the expected return of the individual stock. Okay. So it's just a weighted average of the probabilities times the return. So 0.25 times negative 0.08 plus 0.5 times 0.13 plus 0.25 times 0.23. Okay. Will give you 10.25%. Okay. So if you look up here, you can kind of see how I did it. Okay. Another way to do it that's much easier is you should learn something called a sum product. And the sum product will take the sum of the product of two arrays. And so if you do that, you can get it without having to do 3 different calculations. Okay. So that's what's nice about Excel. But if you look up here, you can see what the expected return is sort of the long way. Okay. Then to find the standard deviation, okay, you have to look at what's going to happen to this security, okay, relative to its average. Okay. So you take negative 0.08 minus 10.1025, okay, and you see how far away the observation's return is relative to the mean, and you square it. Okay. The weighted average of that squared difference is what's called the variance. And if you take the square root of the variance, you end up with the standard deviation. Okay. So this is pretty much standard Stat 101. Okay. But if you remember, a lot of times it's awkward because we don't really do things this way. Okay. But I'll show you how we actually do it somewhat in real life. Okay. This is what's called the expected standard deviation. And what we find is that the historical standard deviation is a good indicator of the expected standard deviation going forward. So we rarely do this in real life because we use the historical standard deviation. So if you kind of wanted to visualize it, okay, over a 10-year period, about 2.5 years, you'd have a recession, and you could use 100 years if you wanted to. Over a 100-year period, you'd have 25 years of a recession. And during a recession, this stock would lose on average about 8%. 50 years would be in normal economic times. This stock would gain 13%. And 25 years out of 100, we'd have a boom, and this stock would earn 23%. So on average, this stock would earn 10.25. Okay. And then you can look at the variation away from the mean over that last 100 years. All right, number 3 says repeat 1 and 2, but change the probabilities up. Assume that all 3 states are equally likely. If you change the probabilities up, you change up the returns and standard deviation. And it's just trying to give you a precursor of the weighting issue as well. All right, if you flip over to number 8. Number 8 says, assume there's a 30% probability of a recession, a 40% probability of normal times, and a 30% probability of a boom. We've got 2 different stocks. This could very well be 2 different mutual funds, A and B. Okay. A earns 4% during a recession, 9% during normal times, and 12% during a boom. B loses 20% during a recession, gains 13% during normal times, and 33% during a boom. Okay. So if we look at A and B, okay, we can find the expected return of A and the expected return of B. Okay. And we can see that the returns are fairly close, but the standard deviations are much higher. Okay. So you can calculate the standard deviation of A and B. Okay. Notice that for A, everything is very close to its average. With B, though, it's pretty far away from the average. Hence, B would have more variation, and hence would be a riskier security. All right, any questions on 1, 2, 3, or 8? 1, 2, 3, or 8? All right, let's go ahead and look at number 9. It says, considering the following information, you've got 3 stocks, A, B, and C. You've got 4 different states of the economy. So if you thought about this over a 100-year period, we'd have 10 years of boom times, 30 years of good times, 40 years of bad times, and 20 years of bust, all mixed in over a 100-year period. Yeah. Here's how stock A performs. Here's how stock B performs. Here's how stock C performs. Remember, you don't have to just use stocks. You can also transfer mutual funds in here. So you could have 3 different mutual funds that are made up of different stocks and different weights. Okay. All right, they said, let's analyze a portfolio of A, B, and C that's made up of 25% A, 50% B, and 25% C. Okay. So if you look closely here, okay, you can see that 25% of your money is earning 18% during a boom, 50% of your money is earning 48% during a boom, and 25% is earning 33% during a boom, which gives you a portfolio return of 36.75%. Yeah. Recalculate this for good and poor and busts. And notice we have to calculate the portfolio's return, not the individual stock's return, so that we can calculate the portfolio's standard deviation. Now, to find the expected return, we look at the probabilities of these happening. Okay. And we can come up with the expected return of this portfolio. Okay. We got it at 2.73%. Okay. So a 25, 50, 25 would give us an expected return of 2.73. We could then find the difference between the portfolio and its average and square that difference. Okay. Then take the weighted average of the squared differences, that's the variance. Take the square root of the variance, and you've got the portfolio standard deviation. All right, this one's very similar, just switches the weights around. Okay. Let's look at number 10 though. Okay. Number 10 is important because it is a historical looking problem. Okay. This is more likely what we do in real life. We're going to calculate the historical average, but not use it for the expected returns. We use beta for the expected returns, but we do use the historical average to find the historical standard deviation. So it says in number 10, I've got the years in here wrong. This is 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015, and 2016. Okay. And it says, hey, find the average over the last 5 years. Okay. But I want to find the portfolio average. So to find the portfolio average, I have to first figure out what the mix is. The mix is 40% in A and 60% in B. Okay. So what I'm going to end up doing is finding what happened to the portfolio in 2012, what happened to the portfolio in 2013, in 2014, 15, and 16. And I'm going to find an average. Okay. In this case, the average is just adding them all up and dividing by 5. It's an arithmetic average because I'm using historical data. Now I look at the squared difference between the year 2012 and the average. So 0.17 minus 0.138. I take that difference and I square it. Okay. I do the same thing for 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016. Okay. Then to find the variance, I add them all up, and instead of dividing by 5, I divide by 5 minus 1 to account for the degree of freedom. Okay. So there's 1 degree of freedom. So divide by n minus 1 gives you a sample variance. Take the square root and you get the standard deviation. Okay. All right. Hopefully all this will work when I post this. Oops. Hopefully all this will work when I post this, and you can go back and look at it. But you ought to be able to follow the Excel examples. Yeah. You ought to be able to look through the book, see what the problems are from the examples, and be able to work the quiz without too much trouble. But if you get an issue, just call me or email me, okay, and I'll walk you through it. All right, so remember, it's kind of weird, but where do you start? Okay. And where you start is sort of using those tools that we have available to us, okay, at school, which if we were in the lab, we would start using that, but we're not at school, so it doesn't matter, okay. But you would go in and you can go in and screen different mutual funds. And you can pick out which stocks you want to put together. You could create your own mutual fund if you wanted to, okay. Most people, though, work at a large firm. There's someone that's creating that efficiency frontier. Okay? They're basically saying, hey, these are the, now it gets a little bit, Edward Jones, for instance, the one we use, they've got about 15 different mutual funds that probably 90% of their people are in. Okay? But what happens is they create an allocation for a particular client. Okay? And then they use those same mutual funds, and when the next client comes in and they have a slightly different risk profile, they use those same 16 mutual funds, and they just allocate the next client a little bit differently than the first using those same 16 mutual funds. Okay. Then a third client comes in that looks a little bit different than the first two, and they come up with a slightly different allocation for that third client, but they use the same mutual funds. Okay. So that's what's nice is once you create that frontier, or your company creates the frontier, okay, you can tweak it a little bit here and there, but most part it stays pretty consistent. Yeah. And I'm just guessing, but I would say if I had 3 different Edward Jones clients, and one was in their 30s, one was in their 50s, and one was in their 70s, okay, all 3 of those people would own the same mutual funds. They just own them in different combinations. Okay. And that's exactly what asset allocation represents. Okay. Which is why you can use the rule of thumb, but it's not appropriate all the time. There might be some variations, because what we saw, it depends which large cap stock fund you pick, or which mid cap stock fund you pick, or small cap stock fund you pick. Okay. So Edward Jones might be different than Charles Schwab, might be different than BlackRock, might be different than Fidelity. Some will use actively managed mutual funds, some will use indexed mutual funds. Index funds are pretty easy because they'll all be very similar. Okay. So in some cases, firms like to differentiate themselves, so they use actively managed funds. Okay. May not necessarily be the best, but time will tell. They usually have slightly higher expense ratios. But you can start to see that once you've created that frontier, the hard part is not spending all your time working on the asset allocation. Once someone's created the frontier, the hard part's going out and finding people to let you invest their money for them. Okay. Once you get them in, it's pretty easy. Okay. And then we just adjust the allocations as they get older or their situation changes. Okay. So that's sort of the basics of asset allocation. It's very important. It's where all of the benefit comes from. Okay. But it can be somewhat replicated simply. Okay, you could probably do 2 mutual funds, an all stock index fund and all bond index fund, and get pretty close to what someone who's using a sophisticated model with 16 mutual funds can get. Okay. And yours might be better off. That's what we don't know. All right, so hopefully this will record, and then hopefully you'll have your quiz open up, and then turn that into me by tomorrow at noon. And if you have any questions or problems, just give me a call. All right. We'll see you on Thursday, and we'll be moving on to options, I think, next, which is a little more exciting. All right.